In the few months that the defendant knew that Rachel was, he went from being attracted to infatuated to obsessed with her, to the point where he lost all ability to think reasonably, to control his impulses. And he made a series of very poor, very alarming, and ultimately very criminal decisions. On 5 occasions, between January 20th, 2022 and February 9th, 2022, he broke into Rachel's mother's house in Somersworth where she was living, driving all of 350 miles, 5.5 hours from his home in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. The first time he broke in, on January 20th, he used access entry by using the back window, breaking into the storage barn and going through some of her belongings. A few weeks later, on February 7th, over the course of 48 hours until February 9th, he made 4 separate entries into her home, this time coming prepared, with a pry bar in order to open her windows to gain entry, and a to-do list, a literal to-do list that included things like getting a key copy, planting microphones in order to hear her, and putting a tracker on her car. Now, while he's in her house during that 2-day time frame, he makes himself at home in the attic, bringing food and even a cup to urinate in. He does things that are on his list, such as making a key copy so that he can have unfettered access. And he also does things like steal her underwear from photographs of her. Some of these entries, the defendant made sure, including the final entry, when he came in around 2 a.m. in the middle of the night, when he knew that Rachel, her mother Victoria, and her 2-year-old son Weston would be sleeping. The defendant broke into Rachel's home for no other reason than he had an obsession with her body, and that culminates that night in that final entry. He goes into her bedroom, lifts up the covers in her bathrobe, and takes a video of her vagina for his own personal pleasure. Now, the facts of this case, from the start to the finish, are almost stranger than fiction, as the truth can sometimes be. Right down from how the defendant first met Rachel, the defendant all the way from Bensalem, Pennsylvania, and Rachel here living in Somersworth. And that was via this OnlyFans platform that we talked about on Monday. Now, OnlyFans is this platform where essentially a person can have a page or a channel, and other users can access that by paying to subscribe. It can be things like cooking tutorials or teaching somebody to play a musical instrument. But of course, the internet, being what it is, it's commonly used to post pictures and videos of naked women, and the men there that pay to access them. And that's what this initial meeting was. Rachel had a page on OnlyFans where she would post nude pictures and videos, and the defendant was her subscriber, fan, if you will. He followed her page, and they engaged in various sexual banter. There's a message option on that app which allows, private requests and things like that. And at first, this relationship is purely transactional. She's communicating with the defendant because she's being paid to. But at one point, she gives him her personal phone number. And this messaging transitions from OnlyFans into this more personal realm of private cell phone texts. And as it did, the messages themselves became more personal. Rachel, who goes by Bella online, told him her real name and that she has a young son. She's a single mother. At first, she's engaging in these text messages because the defendant is buying her things. He purchased her a flat-screen TV and this fireplace space heater item in the hundreds of dollars and sending them to her house. Her address to send them to her house, and later her mother's address when she moves back into the car. But then sometime around November or December of 2021, these lines start to get blurry between this fake sexual online play into a more personal world where real people are having real discussions and the defendant develops real feelings. So he has her address. And one day he takes this very drastic step and he decides to get in his car and drive again that 5.5 hours, 350 miles to her house and just takes his chance and shows up. This is December 7th, 2021. Rachel is understandably a little freaked out. She tells him she can't see see him, she has a 2-year-old, she can't just drop everything and even go out and see the defendant. And he leaves that day without getting to spend any face-to-face time with Rachel. They still have not actually met in person. A couple weeks later, he does this unannounced visit a second time. And that time, she does agree to see him. And they have consensual sex in her apartment before she sends him on his way. After that, from December to mid-January, he comes up 2 more times, unannounced again, 350 miles. But on both of those occasions, he does not get to spend any time with her. She sends him away. Perhaps frustrated by this, on January 20th, 2022, he again drives that long distance to Somersworth, and this time, not only does he not tell Rachel that he's coming, he never tells her that he's there. Instead, he goes in and he breaks into her home. Now you hear about this home that she shares with her mother. At that point, she had moved in around Christmas back in with her mom in her own apartment. And it's this old Victorian house, it's kind of like a maze. And it's got these 2 back rooms, one's unfinished, and the one behind that's almost like a barn that are attached to the house. There's an old wooden window on that back barn that kind of slides to the side to open, that had been secured by someone with a nail so it couldn't slide all the way. The defendant is able to break that window and then prop it back up afterwards so that if anybody was just looking at it quickly, they would not be able to know necessarily that the window is broken of this old area of the house that nobody really goes to that often. So while he's in there in that back room, he starts going through her childhood schoolwork. We know this because he took a photograph of something clearly important to him, a poem that she had written in grade school called Dear Summer Raindrops. And we also know this because his fingerprints were on the cellophane sheet protector that was used to contain it. So when he leaves, and by the way, that pictures, those timestamps from that are about 3 a.m. So he leaves. Rachel and her mother have no idea he's even in town. Obviously no idea that he'd been in their house at 3 a.m. And perhaps emboldened by the fact that he got away with it on January 20th without anybody knowing, he returns a few weeks later. He drives all night, and he gets to Somersworth, New Hampshire, around 4 a.m. on February 7th. So that's a Monday. And as I have said, when he returns, he has a to-do list. This to-do list lays out his plans for when he was there and demonstrates that he is on a mission. And that list, that to-do list, is found later in the notes section of his cell phone. It has things like go to her house, then put a tracker on her car, lockpick her house, find her room and her stuff and get my shit back, get a key copy, put microphones and stuff to hear her, log into her phone hopefully, make sure to be very careful and sneakful around her home, remember get her phone and open it and unblock me on everything. It also details her son's name, his date of birth, a description of where her 2 friends live, that she drives a white Jeep, it lists her license plate, and the name and number of Nate Wilson, the guy she had been seeing. So over the next 2 days, from that Monday to early Wednesday morning when he's arrested, he endeavors to complete this list. On Monday morning, he's able to get in using a pry bar that he brought up on a few different windows that he attempts to use it on, before he's able to get one open and climb inside the home. He takes Rachel's keys right from the living room kitchen area while Victoria is getting ready for work. He leaves, and instead of just keeping that key to use to get inside of her house, he goes and makes a copy so as not to arouse any suspicion. He returns the original. So he sneaks back in the house in order to return the original and puts the keys on Monday night, which Rachel, by the way, and Victoria have been turning the house down looking for all day, and puts them kind of underneath the kitchen island, as if to say, oh, they've been here all along. So it's Monday night, and when Victoria comes down the next morning to get ready for work, she sees these keys that she's been looking for all this time and thinks to herself, oh, I thought I looked there a million times, but here are my keys, thinking nothing of it. And while he's in the house returning the keys, he does take some of Rachel's belongings, as I said, for good measure, her underwear, some photographs of her that were around the house, before he leaves again, this is Tuesday morning now we're talking about, to go on a McDonald's run. Goes and gets some breakfast at McDonald's, some hotcakes and hash browns, and brings them back to the house, at which point Rachel and her mother are gone. And as he enters the house around 10:15, he sort of takes his time, goes around the house, filming the interior, taking pictures of her bedroom all while eating his breakfast. And at some point, he goes into the attic and brings his food up there. We know at some point that day he decides to leave again because he needs to go to Target to purchase a tile tracker. I'm sure if you're familiar with those, it's an Apple product, but they can go on items like keys and stuff, and you use an app in order to track where it's going. He purchased that at Target, and he returns to the house. And this is around 9:44 p.m. that he's making that purchase. When he comes back to the house, it's late at night. And while he's debating his next move of whether or not he's going to sneak in and how, Rachel texts him. And she's saying, thinking, he's in Pennsylvania, that she's drunk, that she's lonely. She's drunk, she's intoxicated, and something she does when she's feeling that way is text the defendant things like, "I wish you were here." But at this point, he had been here. Roughly 43 hours he had been here. But of course, she doesn't know that, and he doesn't tell her. So now we're up to 11:30 p.m. on Tuesday, February 8th, going into the 9th, Wednesday. And we'll get into more of this conversation that the two are engaging in that evening in a bit. But Rachel does eventually go when he says, "Oh, guess what, I'm in town," kind of saying, doing this another unannounced visit. She does agree to go out and meet with him in his truck. They kiss in the car. He pushes her head down to engage in oral sex, which she does for a brief second and then comes up and says, "I don't want to do that." They have a discussion and she leaves, spend all of half an hour together. And she goes back into her house. And keep in mind, this is only the second time that they've ever had a face-to-face interaction. The first being back in December when she agreed to sleep with him. And this being now a total of about 2 hours total that they've spent face-to-face. But she goes back inside and it's now about 1 a.m. The defendant waits a little while. He texts her at 1:51 a.m. and asks if she's awake. There's no answer, and he knows that she's been drinking. He waits 20 minutes and attempts to see if she's awake by calling her from a blocked number. There's no answer, so he re-enters the home. He takes his shoes off and leaves them at the door so as not to make noise. And for almost 2 hours, he's hanging out in her house while she, her mother, and her 2-year-old are sleeping upstairs. Now, only the defendant knows how he spent those 2 hours in her home around 2 to 4 a.m. But we're able to piece together something from evidence that's found at the scene. For example, we know for at least part of the time he was there, he was hiding in the attic because they found the tile device that he had purchased up there after he's arrested. He had wrapped it in blue masking tape as if to conceal what it was, but there it was, the blue tile, the tile that he had purchased. And they also found the McDonald's breakfast food, which he had apparently stored up there for later, as well as some graham crackers that he stole from the cupboard. We know he was up there for at least long enough time that he had to urinate, because the McDonald's cup, which had a previous beverage in it, assumingly, was now filled with urine. We can also piece together some of the things he was doing in the home because of the activity on his cell phone. During those hours where he's in Rachel's home, he's doing things like using Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat. He's listening to music. Actually, his earbuds were found at the scene. He's accessing the flashlight tool on his phone. He's in his Notes app, quite literally checking his to-do list. We know that at some point, he came down and was walking around Rachel's bedroom. And we know this because at different times throughout the night, he's doing things like taking pictures of different items that are in her room. For example, at 2:30 in the morning, he takes a picture of her license plate, which was left on one of the rugs. Sorry, not license plate, license. About an hour after that, he took a picture of her cell phone lock screen. But of all the strange things he does that night, perhaps most concerning is the video he took at 3:19 a.m., when he lifts, again, like I said, the covers of her bed, into her bathrobe, and takes a video zooming in on her bare vagina. After that, he hangs around for about another hour until 4:15 when Rachel wakes up. Now you'll hear about that experience from Rachel herself, and she'll tell you that when she wakes up, she initially sees a figure, or thinks she sees a figure in the doorway. but she's half asleep. And while in the back of her head she's thinking that this could be the defendant, who she knew was obviously around, she thinks maybe also it's her mom, or maybe that she's just imagining it. So she goes around the house to look. She's careful not to wake her son Weston, and she goes into her mom's room, tries to wake her up, and says, "Mom, I think there might be someone in the house." And as they're doing this, they start to hear noises above their head. The defendant in their attic. And then they start to kind of freak out. They call the police. When the police get there and come into the house and walk upstairs, they too can hear these footsteps on the attic and roof. They go outside and use their flashlights, shining them on the roof, and sure enough, there is the defendant, and he scuttles over to the other side. They run back up through the house, and the police officer ultimately enters the attic, sees the window that the defendant had opened and cut a hole in the screen, and ultimately gets the defendant to come back in through the window, and they arrest him in his bare socks. Now, after the defendant had been arrested, all the police basically know is what Rachel and her mom know, and that's the defendant was there in the early morning when he was arrested. At this point, they haven't gone through his phone, they haven't seen the video he took, they haven't fully interviewed Rachel or him, or processed the crime scene, and they don't really know what they're dealing with. So you hear about how this investigation sort of unfolds, and they have to kind of work backward and figure out that he had been in the house for the last 2 days and back in January. And as I try to talk to him to get his side of the story, he downplays it. He says, "Well, we were fighting, we were arguing. I went in that night, sure, but I was just doing it to get my stuff back, and oh, by the way, the door was unlocked. I didn't break in or anything." And after getting that story, police kind of are finding out more details, almost simultaneously. Seeing this video on his phone, finding the urine, the McDonald's, stuff like that in the attic, and they go and they confront him with these details that don't really fit his story. They confront him and confront him and confront him until finally he admits to what he's done. Now, one thing he does not admit to, since the police had not gone back in his phone all the way to January, is that January 20th break-in. So he's not asked about that. He doesn't tell them. But he is specifically asked when he was here in January, when he had come to see Rachel, and he completely disincludes that January 20th trip. Now, I'm sure probably some of you are wondering, what exactly is this relationship between Rachel and the defendant? These two people that meet on this unusual platform are communicating, not spending any real time together, but when they are engaging in sexual activity. And that's a good question. And it's not an easy thing to put a label on. I said earlier this started as a very transactional relationship, and the lines eventually got blurred, and that's true. But to Rachel, at least, they were never in a relationship. And when the defendant is asked, "Were you ever in a relationship?" he agrees and says, "Well, it was always this really complicated thing." In order to get the full picture, it's important to know about where Rachel was at the time. She was 24 years old, a single mom. Despite posting videos of her naked body, which you would think maybe she's a confident person, she actually had incredibly low self-esteem. She had bad relationships with men, and she was drinking a lot. And so when the defendant comes along, showering her with these compliments and gifts, and clearly enamored, she liked it. She even encouraged it. She flirted, she spent her free time on the phone with him, FaceTiming him, free of charge. And even though she didn't really want any sort of real relationship with the defendant, this conversation that she has with him over text messages doesn't necessarily reflect that. And especially true if she had been drinking and texting the defendant. At one point telling him she kind of liked the fact that he was a little obsessed with her. Now, when he would make his surprise visits and this person that was online is suddenly on her street, sure, it freaked her out, but part of her was also flattered. She wanted to be wanted. She wanted the attention from men, good or bad. And another part of her felt guilt. She knew she encouraged his feelings, and it was partially her fault that he would drive up all this way, spend all that time coming to see her, because she would say things like, "I wish you were here." And part of that guilt sort of manifests in the sleeping with him. At times, Rachel was hot and cold. She would go from saying, like, "This is too much, we have to stop talking, I'm gonna block you." And then she'd go back to talking, with always these kind of hypersexualized overtones to the messages, since that is how this relationship initially started. And you'll see some of those messages. You won't see all of them. We'd be sitting here for a full extra week, but you'll see some, and you'll see that especially the messages that they exchanged on that day, February 8th, leading up to when he's arrested. And it's very indicative that day of how they spoke to each other over the course of this time frame. 1 minute, she's accusing him of not being able to move on, asking him to leave her alone, and then 12 hours later, when she's been drinking, asking if he wants to FaceTime her, saying that she thinks she's in love with him, that he's the only one that makes her feel special, and wishing that he was here. And when she's texting him that she's drunk and that she's lonely, he sees those text messages. Obviously, she doesn't know, but he's in town, on her street, and he thinks it's his chance. And he tells her, "What would you do if I was here right now?" And she goes out to see him. So you'll see those messages, you'll see the break in those messages when she goes up to the truck. And you'll see the messages afterwards when she goes back inside and thinking about it, gets really mad at him for thinking that he just has the right to show up at her mom's house, picks a fight with him, and tells him to never come here again. For his part, he does engage in this kind of toxicity. And you might even feel a little bit sympathetic towards him, because at times Rachel is not really being fair with his feelings. But of course, having a girl play with your emotions doesn't give anybody the right to break into your house. Now, I don't know what the defense is going to be when I sit down and he gets up here. He mentioned on Monday something about role-playing. And the defense may be that since there were times where she said that she loved him or liked that he was kind of obsessed with her, this somehow was permission for him to hide in her attic and film her while she's sleeping. Or maybe that this was some kind of sexual fantasy that they both had and were acting out. And while you consider that, or if you consider that, there's a couple things that you'll hear in evidence that I'd like you to pay attention to. And that's when the detective sergeant testifies about this interview that he had with the defendant the day after he's arrested. And he specifically asks, "Did she ever invite you into her house?" He says, "No." He specifically asks, "Did she ever tell you to break in?" And he says, "No." You'll also see 2 notes that the defendant wrote to Rachel. At one point, he had left one on her porch. It's actually not found until a few days after the fact, but a note that says, "Please forgive me for whatever I do." He writes another note in the police department to Rachel, apologizing for what he had done. Also, pay attention to the evidence of his actions, and especially the messages that he sends that day, where he actively tries to hide from Rachel the fact that he is in town, that he never tells her that he had been there, for example, for the 43 hours leading up to the evening of February 8th. And the fact that when the police come that night, instead, or when Rachel wakes up that night, instead of staying and engaging in some kind of like role play, he leaves and runs out off onto the roof in his socks. You also pay attention to what you won't hear. And that's any sort of evidence in phones or messages where they plot out some kind of role-playing sexual tryst that involves him hiding in her attic and urinating into a cup. What the evidence will not show is that Rachel, or her mom for that matter, either asked for or deserved to have the defendant creeping around in and out of their home, stealing their belongings, and violating their most basic privacy rights. What the evidence will show is that the defendant did these things, not because he thought he had permission to, but because he felt compelled, because he had gone from fan to fanatic and became obsessed with Rachel. And at the end of this trial, after you hear all the evidence, I will come back and ask you to find the defendant guilty. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Attorney Starbridge.
Good morning. Ladies and gentlemen, you know, it's funny, yesterday we did the jury selection, we talked about, you know, voir dire, and we tried to get to know it a little bit better. It's funny, I didn't realize that Attorney Guerrero was going to be so upset by the role-playing issue. And you'll see why in a bit. You know, the evidence is going to be, and this is the thing about this case that you're going to find somewhat interesting and maybe a little unusual. There's not a lot in dispute here. You know, I mean, this is a case where, you know, you may hear lots of forensics and things like that. The fact of the matter is, you know, Mauricio was interviewed 3 times for hours, and they were taped and they were transcribed. There's not going to be a lot of dispute about, you know, mechanically what happened. The dispute is going to be about why it happened and what it means. That's what the issue is going to be. You know, and I don't know if you want to call it role play or what have you, but ultimately, you're the ones who can decide whether or not this is a burglary. And that's what the issue really is here. So there may be some, you know, misconduct going on here, maybe some is criminal. The issue here is this a burglary? Is this a burglary? Let me just sort of introduce Mauricio again. He goes by Mo sometimes. I call him Mauricio. I believe that Rachel Nunez calls him Mo. So I'll call him Mo from time to time because you'll see that in multiple interviews that you hear about. Mauricio, when this happened, was 19 years of age. He really a baby. Rachel Nunez, of course, is 24. He does live in Pennsylvania. He lives here with his mother, so that. But she's here by herself because the rest of the family is down in Pennsylvania working at the family restaurant. They have a Mexican restaurant in north of Philadelphia, and it's a group effort. The whole family works there, as does Mauricio. In fact, Mauricio apparently worked to death, and really doesn't have a lot of time to do a lot of socializing outside his work. You know, the complaining, you know, witness, you know, Rachel Nunez, they meet on OnlyFans. You know, and as you know heard from Attorney Garrod, you know, it's a site that's used to sell material, or some people call it content. The person makes the content, there's a subscription service, and the person, you know, subscribes and buys the content. This is typically the extent of any kind of connection, you know, the purchaser and the content maker will have. Usually they don't have, you know, there's no personal phone numbers exchanged, just until, you know, this is unusual. And this is where things really go south, because there is a relationship here. And a relationship which she actually welcomes, not just tolerates, but welcomes. You know, financially she does well. He's generous. And he gives her money and gifts outside the OnlyFans site because she wants them. But let's make no mistake about it. You know, they make that drop into the friend zone and then into, you know, more of a lover issue. They become lovers, and there's no question about it. They had consensual sex twice. They are lovers, by definition, right? They cross that line, and one of the things that is concerning about this case is really what he is a client. You know? And she knows it. She's known this right along. She's been playing him right along. And it's in her interest that he doesn't know. And he doesn't know that he's a client. He thinks that they actually have mutually enjoyed the relationship. And this is what, you know, this is the trouble in this case, is that, you know, this isn't your usual burglary, you know, which is economically motivated. You know, people think to themselves, burglary, well, that's when some guy in a mask breaks in and steals a silverware. That is not this case, not even close. Like I said, there may be some issues, maybe there was an invasion of privacy. You'll have an opportunity to determine that. You'll have an opportunity to determine whether or not this is a burglary, or is it really a criminal trespass? Is he really trespassing and taking pictures he's not supposed to be taking? Burglary, folks, is the unprivileged or unlicensed entry into an occupied structure. Okay? That also can be a trespass. What makes it a burglary is the intent. What makes it a burglary is what was his intent when he crossed that threshold. He has to have the intent to commit a crime before he goes into that house. Okay? He has to go into the house with that pre-understanding that I'm going to break in to steal silver or to do some such thing, to steal what have you. It's obvious from, you know, the indictment says not really clear either, because that had word of invasion of privacy, they're not really sure. But this is going to be the issue, is what was his intent? And honestly, a lot of the stuff that you've heard with the opening, you know, the mystery seeking out the, you know, the fingerprint people, you know, people doing forensics on the cell phones and things like that, and it's going to take hours to get through it. The fact is, not necessary, because largely everyone's in agreement about what happened here. And the reason why everyone knows what happened, because she told them. 3 separate interviews, 3 separate detectives, and it wasn't pleasant for Mauricio. Remember, he's 19. This is a shock to his system. Not only is he finding out the sad truth, which he's a client, not as he finds that out, he's also finding himself in facing police officers for hours and hours and hours. And it's all going to come down to what his intent was. The first time he does come up, it is unannounced. It is in December, and she doesn't want to see him. And so he leaves. Fair enough. And by the way, while this is going on, they're always constantly in communication. You're going to see books and books and books of text messages, folders back there of text messages, thousands of them. Right? This is going on throughout. Whenever he goes up to visit, it's discussed online, or text, and they discuss it afterwards, and sometimes they discuss it before. Sometimes he surprises her, hopes she'll see her. He comes prepared with gifts when he does that, when he comes up. This is the sort of thing that sort of developed. But closer to Christmas, the first visit was roughly January 7th. I think that's probably correct. Well, as he gets closer to Christmas, he comes up and she welcomes him. He's like, okay, great, and they basically have a date. He stays there. He stays for a couple hours in her home. She lives in Dover at the time, and he stays there. And they engage in sexual activities, intercourse, and then he leaves some money and he leaves some gifts. He also, and this is interesting too, because most people who are content providers don't usually give their addresses to their clients. She does, and she does that so he can have stuff delivered to her house, which she's all for. This is, like I said, he's the one that doesn't understand he's a client. She doesn't really ever have any doubt about that. She doesn't have any feelings for him whatsoever, really. It's a pseudo relationship. He has feelings for her, and she knows that, and she exploits those feelings. She exploits those feelings in a very mercenary type way. And remember, she's really in a position of control here. She's older, she's in the business, he's young, naive, stupid. I'm not saying he's a dumb person, but he acts dumb stupidly because he's in love, and she's led him on. And, to say that she's sending mixed messages, which, by the way, is one of the ways she describes this. She's interviewed as well. And one of the ways she describes this, I guess I was sending him mixed messages. Well, that's a wildly, grotesquely understatement. She also describes her behavior as leading him on and messing with his head. Her words. She actually tells him that. Repeatedly, she tells him that she loves him. She tells him that he enjoys having sex with him, and believe me, folks, he's ready to believe that. He wants that more than anything else in the world. So when she says to him that, I love you and I love having sex with you, he's on cloud 9, he's floating now. This is the tragedy here. It's like, he really got duped. And at the end of the day, there he sits. He's still 19. Or maybe he's 20. This is the tragedy here. What you're going to see, what you're going to find after the evidence is closed in this case, and again, largely it's going to come from his own mouth. You're going to hear, at least 3 different detectives talking about interviews they did, and they were videotaped all. What you're going to find is that, yes, he went into the house. Yes, he was making himself at home there. But his intent is going to be the issue. He didn't go in to steal things. He didn't go in to take pictures. The things that he took are dumb underwear, pictures. No silverware, no money. The act of going into his house was impulsive. It wasn't planned out. Yes, he has an idea how he's going to woo her, how he's going to go about that. But he doesn't plan ahead of time and say, well, I'm going to go in there and steal stuff, or I'm going to go in there and take pictures. No, he goes in there impulsively to sort of sit there and wait, because he doesn't live around here, he needs a place to stay. Sometimes he stays in hotels. Sometimes he sleeps in his truck. But this is what we're talking about, because at one point they asked him, well, why did you go in the house? You know, you have this date there, and this is the thing. He goes up the day this happens. You know, February 8th is probably when it happens, maybe the 9th, somewhere around there. When this happens, they actually have another date. He picks her up. He goes out to her house. You know, he waits for her. She comes out. They go off, and they engage in more sex, fellatio, basically. And after that, they have a fight, and some of the things she says to him is, well, I'm going to throw all your stuff away, because she's got some stuff. She's got sunglasses, she's got something his mother gave him. She gave him a special hat, a beanie. She's got the sentimental value, she's got that. There are some things that she has. Also, the TV set, they get in a fight, and she'll say to him, well, just take the TV and go. Or I'm going to throw the TV away, just take it and go. Take the fireplace and go. You know, they have this fight, then they make up. Incidentally, at least one of these times, if not more, he starts to get a little smart and says, you know, this is terrible, I'm out of here. He actually tries to get away from her. She reinitiates the contact. And she actually says to him things like, I actually enjoy having someone obsessed with me. I like this game we're playing. I like this. So this is the problem. This is the problem with this case. You know, she's 5 years older than he is. He's her client. And the tragedy in this case is he doesn't know that. He doesn't know that. And when he went into that building, into that house, it was impulsive. You could just as easily say, well, he took graham crackers, he must have gone in there to eat something. You know, he doesn't know what he's doing at this point. He just goes in. And, you know, frankly, you know, when you counsel talk about the to-do list, he actually says in the to-do list, what are you going to do in there? And he says in his to-do list, get my stuff back. None of that. He's getting his stuff back. Period. So at the end of the day, you're going to have choices. You know, at the end of the trial, we'll all address you again. You know, and Attorney Rod and I will give you our views of the world. You know, which will be different, but you're going to find that the evidence is going to be somewhat, you know, consistent with what everyone's view of the evidence really is. But you'll be given the law by Judge Howard. And Judge Howard's going to talk to you about what your options are. And you'll have options, perhaps to convict him of stuff that he did, or maybe you'll find he did nothing. But at the end of the day, you're not going to be able to find that he went into that house with a purpose to commit any kind of crime. Thank you for your time.